My parents skipped my wife and kids' funeral because it was my brother's birthday. My parents chose my brother's birthday over the funeral of my wife and two children. When I broke the tragic news, my father calmly replied, "Today is your brother's birthday. We can't come." 6 months later, one headline about me sent my entire family into absolute panic when they learned I had, "Hello, my name is Alexander Whitmore, but everyone usually calls me Alex. I'm 39 years old, and if you ask me what I do, I'd probably give a wry smile and say I'm trying to survive the storms my own family has stirred up." The story I'm about to tell isn't a fairy tale, nor is it a Hollywood movie with a guaranteed happy ending. It's my life, a messy tangle of love, betrayal, and wounds that never heal. Sit down because I'm about to tell you. I take you into my world where supermarkets aren't just places to shop, but battlegrounds of families, ambitions, and broken hearts. I grew up in a lavish mansion in Greenwich, Connecticut, where even the air seemed to carry the scent of money. The Whitmore family, my family, was a symbol of wealth and power. My father, Charles Whitmore, was the chairman and CEO of Whitmore Retail Group, a high-end supermarket empire spanning across America. If you ever stepped into a Whitmore store, you'd see shelves gleaming under soft lighting, stocked with bottles of Bordeaux wine, boxes of cheese from Provence, and organic strawberries flown in from South America. Everything was perfect, from the way the light hit the artisanal jam jars to the meticulously trained smiles of the staff. That was my father's world, a world where everything had to be exquisite. I was the eldest son destined to inherit this empire. From a young age, I was taught that the Whitmore name wasn't just a name, it was a legacy. My father would sit at the head of the dining table in our opulent dining room lined with oil paintings and recount how my grandfather built a company from a single store in Manhattan. "Alex," he'd say, his voice low and sharp as a blade, "you are the future of Whitmore Retail. Don't let me down." I'd nod, though deep down, I didn't understand why a 10-year-old boy needed to carry the weight of an entire family's legacy. Our household wasn't just a family. It was more like a dynasty. My mother, Monica, always appeared in silk dresses and pearl necklaces, but her eyes often seemed distant, as if she were living in a place she didn't want to be part of. My younger brother, Nathaniel, for years my junior, was a carbon copy of my father, always knowing how to please him, always knowing when to flash the right smile. And me, I was the one who asked questions, the one who felt suffocated at dinner parties where guests only talked about stocks, real estate, and European vacations. But my life truly changed when I met Elena. She was a light in my dark world, and also the spark that ignited every tragedy that followed. I met Elena Lancaster during my sophomore year at Stanford University. It was a crisp autumn afternoon with golden leaves falling across the campus paths. I was sitting in the library, buried in an economics textbook when she walked in, bringing with her a fresh breeze and scent of freshly brewed coffee. Elena was unlike any girl I'd ever met. She wore a simple sweater, her hair tied up in a high ponytail, and her brown eyes sparkled as if they held an untold story. She sat down at the table across from me, placed a stack of books on the table, and accidentally dropped a pen. I picked it up, handed it back to her, and when our hands touched, I felt a jolt of electricity run through me. "Thank you," she said, flashing a smile that made me forget where I was. "I'm Elena Lancaster, Alex Whitmore." I replied, trying to keep my voice steady despite my heart pounding like a drum. We started talking, and I quickly realized Elena wasn't the type to show off. She was intelligent, sharp, but had a sincerity that made me feel like she had the armor I'd worn for years. She talked about her family, about her father, Robert Lancaster, the founder of Lancaster Market, a chain of budget supermarkets serving working-class people in low-income communities. "My dad always says," Elena laughed, "everyone deserves to eat well, not just the wealthy." I chuckled, but a twinge of unease stirred within me. Lancaster Market. That name was no stranger to me. It was a sworn enemy of Whitmore Retail Group. The Lancasters and the Whitmores were like two sides of the same coin, coexisting in the retail industry, but as different as night and day. Whitmore Retail Group prided itself on being the brand of the elite, where customers would pay hundreds of dollars for a bottle of Italian olive oil, simply because it came in a handcrafted glass bottle. My father often referred to Lancaster Market as those cheap supermarkets with a tone of disdain. "They sell to people who don't know quality," he'd said during a shareholders meeting when I was 16 and allowed to sit in. "They tarnish the retail industry." But Lancaster Market saw things differently. Robert Lancaster, Elena's father, had built his company from a small store in Portland, Oregon, with a mission of bringing quality food to every American household regardless of income. Their marketing campaigns targeted workers, single mothers, and struggling neighborhoods. They even had a free meals program on weekends for children in underserved areas. My father called it cheap PR stunts to win the masses, but either I never dared say it aloud, thought it was something Whitmore Retail could never achieve, making a real difference in the community. The rivalry between the two families wasn't just talk. It was a full-blown war. Whitmore Retail and Lancaster Market had sued each other over an advertising campaign. My father claimed the Lancasters had stolen from us. They fought over prime real estate in major cities like Chicago, Dallas, and Miami. Once at an industry conference, my father and Robert Lancaster nearly came to blows over a comment about the true value of food. My brother Nathaniel jokingly called it the War of the Vegetable Vendors. But to me, it felt like a tragic comedy where both sides were too consumed by their egos to see the harm they were causing to their loved ones. Elena and I fell in love despite all the barriers. Our date nights weren't at fancy restaurants or luxury resorts. We preferred sitting in a small diner in Palo Alto eating burgers and laughing about economics exams. Elena always carried a notebook where she jotted down ideas for improving food supply chains. If we could deliver fresh produce within 24 hours at a low cost, she'd say, her eyes shining, people wouldn't have to choose between quality and their budget. I loved her passion, the way she saw the world, not through the lens of wealth, but through simple values. But I knew our love was a ticking time bomb. My father would never accept Elena, not just because she was Robert Lancaster's daughter, but because she represented everything he despised. The storm hit one winter evening when I brought Elena home to meet my family. I braced myself, but I didn't expect things to go as badly as they did. The Whitmore mansion was aglow with lights. The dining table set like a royal banquet. My mother smiled stiffly. Nathaniel sat with his arms crossed in a scowl, and my father. He looked at Elena as if she were an intruder. Mom, Dad, this is Elena Lancaster. I introduced, trying to keep my voice calm. She's studying with me at Stanford. Silence. A heavy silence. So thick I could hear the ticking of the wall clock. Then my father spoke, his voice cold as ice. Lancaster. Robert Lancaster's daughter. The one ruining the retail industry. Elena gripped my hand under the table, but she didn't back down. Mr. Whitmore, she said, her voice clear and steady. My father built Lancaster Market to help people, not to ruin anyone. My father gave a mocking laugh that sent a chill down my spine. Help people? You think selling cheap goods to the poor is helping them? You're tarnishing this family's name, and Alex, you're disappointing me. That evening ended in a horrific argument. My father stood up, pointed at me, and shouted, "If you choose this girl, you're no longer my son." Nathaniel sat silently, but I saw the corner of his mouth curl, as if he were enjoying the drama. My mother just bowed her head, her hands clutching her napkin. I walked Elena to her car, apologizing for everything, but she just shook her head, hugged me, and said, "Alex, I don't need your family to accept me. I just need you." The weeks that followed were even worse. My father summoned me to his office at Whitmore Retail's headquarters in Manhattan. The room was vast with windows overlooking New York skyline, but the atmosphere inside felt like a prison. He sat behind his desk, his eyes cold and piercing. "I've made my decision," he said. "Nathaniel will inherit the company. You're no longer in the plan." I stood there feeling the floor collapse beneath me. "Because of Elena," I asked, my voice hoarse. "Because you betrayed this family," he replied. "You chose the daughter of our enemy, a girl unworthy of the Whitmore name. From now on, you're on your own." I left the office, my mind reeling. I'd lost my place in the company, my father's approval, and perhaps my entire family. But when I called Elena and heard her warm voice over the phone, I knew I'd made the right choice. She was my home, the place where I belonged. In the meantime, I visited the Lancaster family in Portland, Oregon. Their home was in the suburbs, a modest wooden house with a small garden full of vegetables. Robert Lancaster, Elena's father, welcomed me like an old friend. He wore a worn-out shirt, his hands calloused from years of working in the store. "Alex," he said, placing a hand on my shoulder, "you love my daughter, and that's enough. I don't care if you're Charles Whitmore's son or anyone else, your family." I looked at him, then at Elena standing beside him, and for the first time in my life, I felt truly accepted. But deep down, I knew the war between the Whitmores and the Lancasters wasn't just about business. It was personal, and I was standing on the dividing line. My story is just beginning, because this isn't just a story about supermarkets, money, or power. It's a story about hearts, choices, and the price you pay when you dare to live true to yourself. I stood in front of the mirror in our small Seattle apartment, trying to tie my tie with hands still trembling from memories. It had been 3 years since that fateful evening when my father disowned me, when Nathaniel became the heir to Whitmore Retail Group, and when I chose Elena over the family legacy. 3 years, yet every time I looked in the mirror, I could still see my father's eyes cold piercing, as if he were judging me from afar. I didn't join Lancaster Market, despite Robert Lancaster, Elena's father, offered me a position multiple times. "You have talent. You could help us bring good food to more people," he said during one of my visits to their home in Portland. But I declined. I wanted to stand on my own, not be known as a son-in-law propped up by his wife's family. Or perhaps deep down, I refused because I still felt a pang of guilt. Joining Lancaster Market would feel like betraying my own father, and I wasn't ready for that, at least not at the time. So I chose a different path. I joined FreshRoot, a small logistics startup in Seattle focused on fresh food supply chains. My job was to figure out how to get vegetables, fruits, and fresh meat from farms to consumers within 24 hours at the lowest possible cost. It was grueling work with long days in a stuffy office and late nights crunching data. But I loved it. I loved the feeling of creating something meaningful, working with people who didn't care whose son I was, only what I could do. Elena and I got married on a spring afternoon about 3 years after we graduated. The wedding took place in a small church on the outskirts of Portland. There were no lavish receptions, no guests in Armani suits or glittering ball gowns. Just a Lancaster family, a few close friends from Stanford, and a priest with a kind smile. Robert walked Elena down the aisle, his eyes shining with pride and a touch of sadness. "You're my son now, Alex," he whispered as he hugged me after the ceremony. "Take care of her." No one from the Whitmore family showed up. I had sent an invitation, though I knew in my heart they wouldn't come. My mother sent a brief text. "Wishing you happiness, Alex. I'm sorry." My father said nothing. Nathaniel posted a photo on social media, raising a glass of wine at a party in the Hamptons with the caption, "Congrats to my brother on his big day, choosing love over family." I read it feeling a stab in my chest, but I didn't respond. I'd learned that sometimes silence is the strongest reply. Seattle, where Elaine and I settled, is a city with mild climate surrounded by lush nature. Our apartment was on the 5th floor of a modern building with windows overlooking Puget Sound. It wasn't as grand as the Greenwich Mansion, but it was ours. I still remember the day we moved in. Elena standing amid a pile of cardboard boxes, hands on her hips, laughing. "Alex, we have a kitchen table, a real kitchen table." I laughed, pulled her into my arms, and we stood there surrounded by chaos, happier than ever. 2 years later, Olivia was born. She was a miniature version of Elena. Big brown eyes, a radiant smile, and a stubborn streak that both charmed and exasperated me. When Olivia was 3, Marcus arrived, a quiet boy with eyes just like mine. Watching our 2 children play on the living room floor, I felt like I'd found the true meaning of life. It wasn't the gleaming shelves of Whitmore retail, the revenue numbers, or the million-dollar deals. It was these moments. Olivia's laughter as I pushed her on a swing. Marcus babbling "Papa" as I lifted him into my arms. Elena was the soul of our family. She worked part-time for a nonprofit helping underserved communities access fresh food. In the evenings, she'd sit at the kitchen table writing or discussing new ideas for fresh fruit with me. If we could cut transportation costs by another 10%, she'd say, her eyes sparkling, we could get fresh carrots to even the poorest neighborhoods. I loved how she always thought of others, how she turned the simplest things into something extraordinary. But not everything was perfect. Despite my efforts to cut ties with the Whitmores, their shadow loomed over my life. My mother called occasionally, her voice laced with guilt, but never daring to go too far. "Alex, are you doing okay? How are the kids?" she'd ask, and I'd answer briefly, knowing she'd never stand up to my father. Nathaniel was different. He seemed to relish, reminding me I'd been cast out of family. Once he sent me an article about Whitmore retail with a message. "Look at what you're missing. We just opened 5 new stores in California. Too bad for you." I didn't reply, but his words still cut deep, not because I regretted leaving my father's empire, but because a small part of me still hoped my family would change. I wrote letters to my mother sending photos of Olivia and Marcus, sharing stories about our life in Seattle. But those letters rarely got a response. Once my mother sent a birthday card for Olivia with a $10,000 check. I returned it with a note. "Thank you, Mom, but we don't need the money. We're happy." Life at FreshRoute wasn't always easy. Our startup was small, competing with giants in the logistics industry. Some weeks I worked 80 hours dozing off at my desk and coming home with dark circles under my eyes. But Elena was always there with a hot cup of coffee and a smile. "You're doing something amazing, Alex." She'd say, "Every FreshRoute truck is a family eating fresh produce. Don't give up." And I didn't. We developed a real-time tracking system that cut delivery times from 48 hours to 24. Small farms began to trust us, and FreshRoute's revenue grew steadily. I wasn't making millions like my father, but I was proud that my work had meaning. I was building something not to get rich, but to make life better for others. One Sunday afternoon, Elena and I took Olivia and Marcus for a picnic at a park near our home. Olivia, now 5, ran around the grass chasing a butterfly. Marcus sat on my shoulders, giggling as I pretended to be a horse. Elena lay on the picnic blanket, reading a book, but occasionally looking up at us with a gentle smile. "You know," she said, "sometimes I think we found paradise." I sat down beside her, pulling her into my arms. "My paradise is you," I said, and she laughed playfully, punching my shoulder. "So cheesy, Whitmore." It was a perfect moment. One of those you want to frame and keep forever. But I didn't know that just a few hours later, everything would shatter like a bursting bubble. That was the last picnic where I could still hold Elena's hand, where I could watch Olivia and Marcus run across the grass. We left the park as the sun set, its golden glow stretching across the lake. Olivia dozed off in the back seat, clutching her butterfly kite tightly. Marcus was half asleep, his head resting on his sister's shoulder. Elena sat beside me, softly, humming a lullaby her mother used to sing. I drove my heart, feeling like everything in the world was right. The road back to Seattle was a two-lane highway winding through fields and forests. I kept a steady speed, the radio playing soothing jazz. Elena reached over, her fingers intertwining tightly with mine. "Today was fun, wasn't it?" she said, her voice soft. "We should do this more often." I nodded, smiling. "More often. Maybe next week we—" My words were cut off by a blinding light ahead. A massive container truck, like a monstrous beast, veered across the center line, heading straight for us. I only heard Elena scream, "Alex, be careful," before everything plunged into darkness. I woke up in a stark white room, the sharp smell of antiseptic filling the air. My head throbbed, my left arm was numb, and a strange emptiness gripped my chest. A nurse stood by my bed, checking a chart. "You're awake," she said, her voice gentle but cautious. "You have a broken arm and some minor injuries. You're very lucky." Lucky? The word rang like a cruel joke. I tried to sit up, but a wave of pain made me groan. "My wife? My kids? Where are they?" I asked, my voice as if my throat were filled with sand. The nurse looked at me, her eyes darting away. "I'll get the doctor," she said, hurrying out. A chill ran down my spine. I knew something was wrong, but I didn't want to believe it. I couldn't. The doctor entered, a middle-aged man with eyes full of compassion. He sat beside my bed, his voice low. "Mr. Whitmore, I'm so sorry. The accident, it was severe. Your wife and 2 children, they didn't make it." The world around me collapsed. I heard his words, but they weren't real. They couldn't be. Elena, the girl with a smile brighter than the sun, couldn't be gone. Olivia, my little girl with curly hair and a laugh that echoed, couldn't have vanished. Marcus, my tiny son, who called Papa every time I walked into the room, couldn't be gone. "No," I whispered, shaking my head. "No, you're wrong. They're fine. They have to be." The doctor placed a hand on my shoulder, but I shoved it away. "Take me to them," I shouted, trying to stand despite the searing pain in my broken arm. "Where are they?" "Elena, Olivia, Marcus." The nurse and doctor had to restrain me, injecting a sedative to keep me from hurting myself. I collapsed, tears streaming down my face, but no sound escaped my lips. Only a vast, cold void swallowed everything I had ever loved. The days that followed passed like a nightmare. I lay in the hospital, staring at the ceiling, trying to piece together what had happened. The truck driver had fallen asleep. The police told me he lost control, crashing head-on into our car. He survived with only a few scratches. But my family, they didn't stand a chance. I didn't know what to feel about the driver. Anger, hatred, or just emptiness. I no longer had the strength to feel anything. Elena's parents flew from Portland as soon as they heard. They sat by my bedside, silently holding my hand. Margaret, Elena's mother, wept, her frail shoulders trembling. "Alex, you're our son," she said, her voice choked with sobs. "We lost Elena and the kids, but we won't lose you." Robert didn't say much, but his eyes were filled with pain. He sat there looking a decade older, as if the accident had taken not only his daughter and grandchildren, but a piece of his soul. "What do you need, Alex?" he asked. "Anything? Just tell me." I didn't answer. I didn't know what I needed except to turn back time to hold Elena, again to hear Olivia's laugh and Marcus's voice. But time never grants such wishes. The Whitmores, my own family, were a different story. I called my mother, leaving a trembling voicemail about the accident. I hoped even just a little that they'd come, that they'd set aside their pride to be with me in this moment. But no one came. My mother called back, her voice heavy with guilt. "Alex, I want to come, but your father, he wouldn't allow it. He said I shouldn't interfere with the life you chose." I gripped the phone, feeling my chest constrict. "Mom, my wife, and your 2 grandchildren are dead," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "Do you understand? They're dead." My mother sobbed over the phone, but she didn't come. My father has always said nothing. Later, I learned a painful truth. My father was busy hosting a birthday party for Nathaniel at the Greenwich Mansion with expensive wine and high-profile guests. The funeral for my wife and 2 children was held at a small church in Portland where Elena grew up. I stood before 3 coffins, 2 so tiny they shattered my heart. Olivia still held her butterfly kite in her eternal sleep. Marcus, with his peaceful face, looked like he was having a sweet dream. And Elena, she looked like she was merely asleep, her brown hair gently framing her face, her lips closed as if she had something left to say to me. I sent a funeral notice to the Whitmores despite Robert's advice against it. They don't deserve it, Alex, he said, his voice thick with anger. But I sent it anyway, foolishly hoping they'd come that my father would see the 3 graves and realize he was wrong. But no one came. Not a formal condolence. Not a single message. I stood before the graves, clutching the crumpled eulogy as tightly as my broken heart. Robert stood beside me, his hand on my shoulder. "You're my son," he said, his voice firm despite his red-rimmed eyes. "You lost your wife, your children, but you haven't lost your family. We're here, Alex. We'll always be here." I nodded, but inside I knew I'd lost everything. Elena was my light. Olivia and Marcus were why I woke up each morning. Now I was left with only a void, and I didn't know how to fill it. The weeks after the funeral, I lived like a shadow. I returned to our Seattle apartment, where everything reminded me of them. Olivia's pink dress hung in the closet. Marcus' tiny shoes sat in the corner, and Elena's notebook filled with ideas about fresh food lay open on the kitchen table. I couldn't touch them, but I couldn't throw them away either. Each night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling trying to recall Elena's voice, Olivia's laugh, or the way Marcus gripped my finger. But the harder I tried, the more they slipped away. Robert and Margaret visited often, bringing food and stories of Elena as a child. They tried to pull me from the abyss, but I knew they were hurting, too. We were survivors left to face a world that no longer felt the same. One evening, as I sat alone in the dark apartment, the doorbell rang. I opened it, expecting Robert, but it was my mother. She stood there in a long coat, her eyes red. "Alex," she said, her voice trembling. "I'm sorry I couldn't come to the funeral of your father. Don't talk about him." I cut her off, my voice cold. "Why are you here?" She stepped inside, wrapping her arms around me, and I felt her trembling. "I wanted to see you," she whispered. "I wanted to know if you're okay." I didn't answer. I wasn't okay, and she knew it. But I let her stay because she was still my mother. We sat in silence, and for the first time I realized she too was a victim of my father trapped in the gilded cage of the Whitmore family. But her presence couldn't ease my pain. It only reminded me that my family, the ones who should have been there, had chosen to stay out of my life. 6 months after the accident, I made a decision. I couldn't keep living like a shadow. Couldn't let grief consume me. I stood before the mirror, staring into my own hollow eyes, and told myself, "But you have to do something, Alex, for Elena, for Olivia, for Marcus." I wrote a final letter to my father, mother, and Nathaniel. It was brief, just a few lines. "I'm no longer part of the Whitmore family. Don't contact me again." I sent it and turned off my phone. I sold all the shares my grandfather had left me in Whitmore Retail Group, a substantial sum, but I didn't need it. Money couldn't buy back what I'd lost. What I needed was a cold, decisive plan for revenge. No mercy. Then I called Robert Lancaster. "Dad," I said, calling him that for the first time, "I want to join Lancaster Market. I want to carry on what Elena dreamed of." Robert was silent for a moment. Then he spoke, his voice thick with emotion. "Welcome home, son." I moved to Portland a week later. Robert and Margaret welcomed me like a son, returning from a war. Their wooden house was the same as ever, with its small garden full of vegetables and a faint smell of freshly baked bread in the air. Margaret hugged me tightly, tears streaming down her cheeks. "We'll get through this together, Alex," she said. "For Elena, for the kids." I nodded, but inside, I knew I hadn't come here just to heal. I came to fight, not only for Elena, but for myself. The Whitmores had abandoned me, and now I would abandon them. Joining Lancaster Market sent shockwaves through the media. Business headlines blared. "DeSone, son of Charles Whitmore, joins direct competitor." Some called me a traitor, others a maverick breaking tradition. I didn't care. I wasn't doing this for fame or to prove anything to the world. I was doing it for Elena, for Olivia, for Marcus, and to find meaning in a life that had been shattered. Robert brought me into the leadership team as Director of Strategic Development. Lancaster Market's office was in a modest building in Portland, devoid of the oil paintings or New York skyline views of Whitmore Retail's headquarters. But here, I felt a warmth and sincerity I'd never experienced in Greenwich. Employees called Robert Uncle Rob, and they worked not for money, but for a shared belief in the company's mission to bring good food to every American family. On my first day at Lancaster Market, I sat in a meeting room with Robert and the other directors. They looked at me with curiosity, some with skepticism. "You're Charles Whitmore's son," the finance director said, his tone guarded. "Why are you here?" I met his gaze without blinking. "I'm here because I believe in what Lancaster Market is doing, and because I want to carry on my wife's dream, bringing fresh, affordable food to everyone, not just the wealthy." The room fell silent. Then Robert smiled, placing a hand on my shoulder. "That's the answer I wanted to hear," he said. "Let's get to work, Alex." I threw myself into the job, like a man running from his own shadow. Each morning, I woke at 5, rereading Elena's notebook for inspiration from her ideas. I proposed a new strategy, leveraging the logistics technology I'd worked on at FreshRoute to build a fresh in 24 hours distribution system. The idea was simple but ambitious. Deliver fresh food from farms to stores within a day at the lowest cost possible. If successful, it would position Lancaster Market to compete directly with Whitmore Retail, especially in major cities like Chicago, Miami, and Dallas, my father's untouchable strongholds. Robert backed me fully. "You can do this," he said during a late-night meeting. "Elena will be proud of you." Hearing her name made my heart clench, but I nodded, gripping my pen tightly. "I won't let you down, Dad," I said, and for the first time, I felt I wasn't just working for Elena, but for myself to prove I could stand tall without the Whitmore name. The Eat Well Without Being Wealthy campaign launched a few months later. It was my idea inspired by the notes in Elena's notebook. We weren't just selling food. We were telling a story about ordinary families, workers, single mothers, people who didn't need to spend hundreds of dollars for a quality meal. Our ads appeared on TV and social media featuring smiling farmers, children holding fresh apples, and a message Lancaster Market, good food for everyone. The campaign was a direct blow to Whitmore Retail. My father, with his philosophy of luxury goods for the elite, couldn't fathom why middle-class customers, once the backbone of Whitmore's revenue, were turning away. Articles began to compare the two. Lancaster Market is redefining food retail, while Whitmore Retail is stuck in the past. I read those articles feeling a mix of pride and vindication, but my greater purpose was clear. I was doing this because I believed Elena was right. Everyone deserves to eat well, not just the rich. One evening, as I worked late in the office, my phone rang. It was Nathaniel. I hesitated, but picked up. "Hey, big brother." His voice came through cold and mocking. "Heard you're making waves at Lancaster Market. Congrats, trader." "Nathaniel," I said, struggling to stay calm. "If you're just calling to mock me, hang up." "Oh, no," he sneered. "I just wanted to remind you that you're digging your own grave. Dad won't let this slide. You think you can beat Whitmore Retail? You're wrong." I didn't respond. I hung up, but Nathaniel's words echoed in my mind. I knew my father. He wasn't just a businessman. He was someone who never forgave those who dared challenge him. And I, his eldest son, was now his greatest enemy. I sat in my small office at Lancaster Market's headquarters in Portland, the fluorescent light casting a glow over a desk cluttered with papers and charts. In front of me, a computer screen displayed the latest revenue data. Lancaster Market was growing, not in small steps, but in leaps and bounds. The Eat Well Without Being Wealthy campaign had shaken up the food retail market. Our stores in Chicago, Miami, and Dallas, cities once considered impregnable fortresses of Whitmore Retail, were now teeming with customers. Housewives, workers, even those who had once been loyal to my father's upscale brand, were flocking to Lancaster Market for fresh, affordable produce. But I didn't let myself get complacent. Every night before bed, I opened Elena's notebook, rereading her slanted handwriting. Fresh in 24 hours. Every family deserves it. Those words were the fire that kept me going. The reason I woke up each morning and threw myself into work like a man racing against time. I wasn't doing this to defeat my father, though a small part of me couldn't deny the satisfaction of seeing Whitmore Retail falter. I was doing this for Elena, for Olivia, for Marcus, and to prove that a person could live true to their values no matter the cost. Robert Lancaster called me into his office one autumn morning as golden leaves began to fall across Portland streets. He sat behind his desk, his silver hair gleaming, but his eyes as sharp as the day I first met him. "Alex," he said, sliding a folder across the table, "you've done what I never dared to dream. Lancaster Market is now a name on everyone's lips, but do you know what that means?" I looked at him waiting. Robert smiled, but his smile carried a hint of concern. "It means Charles Whitmore won't sit idly by. He's losing market share, losing shareholders, and most importantly, he's losing his reputation. A man like Charles doesn't accept defeat." I nodded, unsurprised. I knew my father too well. He was the kind of man who would rather burn his empire to the ground than let it fall into someone else's hands. "I'm ready," I said, my voice steady. "If you want to fight, I'll give him one." Robert looked at me, his gaze softening. "You remind me of Elena," he said. She had that same look, the look of someone who never gives up. I clenched my fists, feeling my heart tighten. Every mention of Elena brought her image to mind, her radiant smile and sparkling eyes. But I didn't let my emotions pull me under. I had a mission, and I would see it through. Whitmore Retail began to crumble faster than I expected. Quarterly financial reports showed their revenue declining steadily, especially in cities where Lancaster Market had expanded. Their stores in Chicago and Dallas had to close. Unable to compete with our prices and delivery speed, middle-class customers, once captivated by Whitmore Retail's glamour, realized they didn't need to spend hundreds of dollars on a bottle of olive oil or imported cheese. They wanted fresh, affordable food, and Lancaster Market was delivering it. I drew on my experience from fresh route to